Welcome everyone to What is Black, a parenting podcast that addresses issues important to raising healthy and thriving Black children and teens. I'm your host, Dr. Jacqueline Douge, and on today's episode, I get to speak with Dr. Elizabeth Hinton about her new book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. Dr. Elizabeth Hinton is an author and an associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University and a professor of law at Yale Law School. So welcome to the show today, Dr. Hinton.
Thank you so much, Dr. Douge.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So you can call me Jackie. I just want to make sure I give you your due credit. So, I can continue to call you Dr. Hinton, or I can go with Elizabeth, whatever you prefer.
Whatever you prefer. I'm good with either one.
Okay, so Jackie's good for me. So again, thank you. It's a pleasure for you to join me on this show.
Thank you, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here.
And so, before we started the interview, I was praising you about this book because for me, like I said, it connected all the dots, right? For this season, I'm really talking about how do we move forward, right? There's no new normal. There's no going back to normal after all the events of last year, right?
Right.
And I don't know if we want to go back to normal, right? So this idea of, looking at different systems and how they serve Black families and Black children, of course, the judicial system, criminal justice system, right, has a long legacy of how it interferes, right, or interacts with Black communities. So I wanted to jump off by saying that, I loved your book because I was trying to figure out how to do this, right? How to have this conversation about not just about police violence, right, but really looking at historically, and then even the moment in time that you choose, right, the 60s and 70s. So before I go on any further, if you can just tell us a little bit about America on Fire, please.
So there's so much that we can say about the kind of criminalization of Black youth and the impact of the rise of mass incarceration and the modernization of policing in the late 20th century on Black youth and Black families in particular. But America on Fire is a history of Black rebellion, Black political protests from the 1960s to the present. And it really encourages us to recognize the ways in which violence directed, often precipitated by a police encounter during that period was very much rooted in the same shared grievances of the mainstream civil rights movement. That is for equal jobs, decent jobs, access to equal educational opportunities, and full economic and political inclusion in American society. And so the book tries to reckon with this violence. Much of it was done by young people, some people as young as not just high school age, but 10 and 12 years old. And this was the most dominant form of protest from the late 60s to the early 70s. And it encourages us to think about, why this form of political violence or rebellions persisted, and the missed opportunities and the misguided set of investments that policymakers at all levels of government made, not into investing resources into communities that would have led to more vibrant families and a whole different set of outcomes, but into police and surveillance and incarceration. And of course, as the events of last summer demonstrated, we're still very much living with the consequences of this failed policy choice and the failed and misguided set of punitive policies that have really defined domestic programs in the United States since the civil rights movement.
And, what you're saying again resonates, I got goosebumps from your conversation because I was remembering a quote I heard from someone, and unfortunately, I don't remember who to attribute the quote to, but they talked about, they mentioned how policies, related to priorities, right?
Exactly.
Whatever the priority is, we create a policy for that priority. And, what the book I think does so well, like you spoke to, is the fact that, police really both became a verb and a noun, right? So they did everything. They policed everything. And they ultimately were left responsible for addressing the social ills that, the government or society decided not to invest in.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you said that, you said that so beautifully. And that's one of the things that the history in this book and that my first book really traces, that, the kind of modernization of police began in the mid 1960s, began during the height of the civil rights revolution and progressive social change, but also in a moment when many Americans, especially younger generations, were pushing back against or resorting to violence as a way to force the changes that nonviolent direct action protests had not brought about. And instead of addressing the root causes of rebellion, the socioeconomic root causes, and meeting the demands of the mainstream civil rights movement, which were shared, policymakers made the decision to ultimately divest from social welfare programs and invest instead in policing and surveillance and incarceration. So out of this period of the 1960s, we don't get a job creation program for low-income people of color that, of course, would have changed life circumstances for families of color and children for generations. We get a job creation program for police, which of course changes life outcomes and conditions for Black families that are targeted by these punitive policies for generations in devastating ways, instead of actually helping to build healthier and vibrant communities.
Now, in your book, you mentioned a couple of terms. So you describe what's called the cycle. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. And I think it speaks to your opening about what the book is about. But again, if you could just talk a little bit, because I love that simple word, right? That just kind of just again connected those dots for me. So I was wondering if you could talk about what the cycle.
Yeah. So one of the things that that we've been stuck in that really kind of emerged in this period is the cycle of police violence and community violence that we've been unable to get out of. And that is, when in response to the changes of the 1960s and the threat of rebellion, of course, beginning with Harlem in 1964, after a 15-year-old Black high school student was fatally shot by a New York police officer, and Harlem erupted for several days. These rebellions happened through every summer of Johnson's presidency, and they begin to increase in scale and intensity, and eventually culminate in the declaration of the war on crime, the launch of the war on crime, and an unprecedented investment on the part of the federal government into local police forces, into militarizing police, into facilitating the transfer of surplus Army weapons from Vietnam. So things like AR-15 and M4 carbine rifles and bulletproof vests and tear gas and helicopters, many of the weapons that are ubiquitous in police departments today, while at the same time expanding policing greatly. And as these programs are being rolled out, beginning in the late 1960s especially, communities responded not by saying, okay, this is, this will help keep us safe, or this is what we wanted when we said, this is what we meant that when we said that we wanted equal rights. Many of the communities, and especially the Black youth who were targeted by these programs, because, during this period in the Johnson administration who developed these policies, believed that that Black men in particular between the ages of 15 and 24 were responsible for the majority of the nation's so-called rioting and crime, and then targeted Black youth accordingly. And, the kids responded when a police officer would come and arrest them for playing in the park, or, come and break up a family gathering by throwing rocks and bottles at the police. And very often when this kind of initial act of collective violence emerged, there was a group of youth who began taunting a police officer who was trying to arrest one of them or maybe trying to brutalize one of them. The police officer would call for backup. More police would come. They might, throw tear gas grenades, and then maybe the parents would come out. More members of the community would come out into the streets, and then all of a sudden, you have hundreds of people on the streets. Sometimes the police would then come back with even more force and begin arresting people, and people would then go and burn buildings or loot stores. And so this, and the cycle would play out for several days. One of the big lessons of the cycle, and one that I think is really important for us to recognize in American policing today, is that, police violence, like that violence in itself precipitates or helps to lead to further community violence. Again, when you respond to ordinary and everyday activity as something that's criminal, people tend to respond or meet that violence with violence. I mean, this is something too that I think there are really important distinctions between what we saw in the late 60s and early 70s, and really through the remainder of the 20th century, and what we saw beginning in Ferguson in 2014, which is that, in the 60s and 70s, most of the rebellions, the political violence that emerged in Black communities was in response to the policing of ordinary and everyday activity. And, when you get to Ferguson in 2014, the cities that have turned, to violence, the people who burned buildings or looted stores or threw water bottles or rocks at police, all of these protest incidents started peacefully, and most of the protests of 2020 were peacefully and became violent after the police started beating people or throwing tear gas grenades. So we're still very much in this cycle, and as long as the kind of fundamental logics of policing remain, and police continue to be embraced as the solution to managing poverty and inequality, this cycle will unfortunately continue.
And so you spoke to the fact that, we haven't learned our lesson yet, right? So,
yeah.
Or, maybe some communities have, but not nationally, right? Really. And the thing that really came to my mind as well is, so for the American Academy of Pediatrics, right, there was a study done, I believe it was either late last year, that looked at police encounters, right, with Black and Hispanic adolescents. And the data showed that Black and Hispanic adolescents are more likely to die from police encounters than white teens. And again, this happened in the past, right? So I wanted to get your thoughts about this continued pattern, and your thoughts about how do we address that?
Yeah, and let me just say too, I think many of the communities where these policing and surveillance and certainly mass incarceration has been most energetically implemented know that, they've known the lesson. They knew the lesson. They knew back in the 60s and 70s when they're saying, we don't want police, we want resources, we want community control. This is what Black people have long been calling for. These have been the guiding principles of the Black freedom struggle. And in part due to, again, this investment and embrace in policing and locking people up as the solution, rather than investing in the people, rather than investing in the communities, has created this dynamic where, as that study from the American Pediatrics Association shows, not only are youth of color more likely to die by police than their white counterparts, but they're also, those who are living in communities that are over-policed and underprotected are also more likely to die at the hands of one another. I mean, so you have to kind of ask yourself, like, why is it that gun violence in our communities is so high in the communities that are policed so heavily? That should be an indication to people that something about police isn't working. It's not actually preventing violence and social harm. It's not actually keeping people safe. There's got to be something else is needed, and that something else goes beyond the police. And I think that's really thinking beyond the police as a solution is really what so much of the protest movements today are about.
And I think what was interesting and really poignant about some of the some of the evidence you present, right, in your book about how the cycle is continuing or has been perpetuated, is that those communities, right, there were, I think there's one part of the chapter, right, with one later in the book where the Rodney King incident, right, his and how quote unquote gang members, right, they basically created a manifesto, a doctrine to say, like, how can we improve our communities? So they were coming to the table, but yet for all the work that they were doing, and even there were some other examples of how communities, okay, they laid out what's going to help us, right? What's going to help our community, and no one listened.
Right. I mean, there's so many. That's like one of the tragedies of the book, and one of the recurring, most unfortunate recurring themes is that there's so many missed opportunities. Like, it's not as if policing was the only, and incarceration were the only solutions. The alternatives were presented time and time again, and policymakers chose to ignore them. So in the case of Los Angeles in 92, before the rebellion, sets of Crips and Watts groups in Watts, Los Angeles had began to talk about a truce, had began to say, you know what, we need to stop this violence. It's not doing anything for us. It's not doing anything else for the community. We need to figure out how we can redirect this and turn what we have into something positive. And that truce really took hold during the rebellion, which presented, South LA a new opportunity to rebuild. And basically, many residents were calling for grassroots empowerment in the rebuilding and restructuring effort following the 92 rebellion in LA, which was the most damaging and destructive of the 20th century and probably in US history as a whole. And the Crips and Bloods said, okay, we're gonna stop the violence. We're gonna stop shooting each other, and we're gonna develop an economic plan for our community, and we wanna change things. So we want to create a better and more vibrant community, and with that, the violence is going to end. But here's what we need from you. It was essentially like they called for just under $4 billion to completely revitalize the infrastructure of South LA in really innovative and exciting ways. They called for new investments in public schools. They called for computers for every kid. They called for an end to forced busing. They say, we don't want to go to other schools. We want to go to our schools. We just want our schools to be better. The Crips and Bloods proposal called for residency requirements in policing, so that, essentially tenant patrols, so that residents themselves would be responsible for public safety. They called for universal health care for Black residents in South Central. And perhaps, most importantly, at the center of it, they called for jobs. They said, okay, we'll stop banging if you give us economic opportunities and jobs that we want to do. No problem. Like, this is the prescription to ending the violence. And none of what they said, I mean, they was about the police. And for me, that story was just so important to highlight because, unlike the Kerner Commission in 1968, which was a task force of the Johnson administration, which similarly recommended, as a response to rebellion, a massive infusion of resources into low-income communities of color to the federal government, another policy that was ignored. So unlike the commissions, and there were many other commissions at the state and local level who also recognize the socioeconomic root causes of the political violence and the most effective remedies to address them outside of the police. But one of the things that I think was so important about the LA chapter is that it was one of many examples of a concrete plan, because of course residents are always, residents are calling for these kinds of investments in jobs, as they're throwing rocks and burning stores. This is what residents are always saying. But the Crips and Bloods proposal is a concrete, beautiful proposal that was completely ignored by authorities in Los Angeles. And you just have to wonder, with all of these things, had we made that investment, had our elected officials made that investment back in 68, had in Los Angeles, municipal officials invested in and believed in the very promising program that the Crips and Bloods put forward, what would this country look like today? What would Los Angeles look like today?
Oh, I almost want to write that story, right? And just kind of envision
right.
what it would look like, right? So then maybe that might become a blueprint. And I'm hoping now, right? We'll see if now might be the point in history where we can make some changes, right? And that's the thing. I mean, I think there's been some progress, right? But when you keep seeing the same pattern happening over and over again, right? It does make you wonder, right? It's like either there really is not, there's just this lip service paid to the change, or are individuals so overwhelmed they're like, well, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the question though. I mean, because it does feel like we're really at a crossroads and we have to do something soon and fast. And it does seem like now is the time. And that's part of the reason why, especially writing the book against the backdrop of COVID and the protests and the presidential election, I just felt like this history was a way that I could contribute to the movement, to the struggle, to the cause. And it just felt so urgent to me. And let me also say, since I have the pleasure of talking to you about parenting issues as a mother. I mean, my daughter is almost 2 and I'm expecting a son in July. And for me, I that's why I do this work, right? Like I want to build a better world for my children and my grandchildren and my great, great, great grandchildren and everybody's babies, not just my babies, but I look at them and they're what inspire me. I look at my daughter like, this is why I'm doing this. This is why this history is so important. Times when I wanted to give up, you look to the younger generations, even my students, and say, I might not see everything that I'm building towards in my lifetime, but I do this because I want to make a better world for you and for all of us.
And I thank you for doing that work, because I think over the last couple of years, like with the from the 1619 project,
mm-hmm.
Even to your work and other writers, I think history, right, is becoming the catalyst for change, right? Because there's and even I really believe so. Because even when you think about, like we were talking a little bit about some of the adaptations, regarding Lovecraft Country,
mm-hmm.
The Tulsa
massacre. You can call it. That's what I call it.
Oh, they're not riots, right? They're massacre. It was a massacre. It was also a massacre, right? There's so many people who are like waking up. It's like, okay, that occurred, and I didn't know about it, right? Because it's not in the history book,
right.
And what's nice about it is that history, especially told from different perspectives, provides a broader picture, right, and a clearer picture, right? I almost liken it to pixels, right? So the more we can find out about what's been going on and the foundation of our society, it becomes clearer, right? The lens that we use, and I think it should be history, to determine and define where we've been, so we can really know how to move forward.
Well, listeners, my smile is really wide, because I love it when people say that history is the tool for us. Because I believe, I believe it is one of the most important tools, if not the most important tool. Because if you don't, and that's why I decided to become a historian, and why, one of my most important mentors, Manni, he said, history is a weapon in which we fight, meaning in which we fight to advance the Black freedom struggle. And that's why I became a historian, because we're not going to be able to figure out our present and where to go in the future unless we really understand our past. And that's the thing about what part of our unique experience in this country is, that so much of our history has been denied. And now today, even with the 1619 project and all of the backlash against that, we see that like people are scared of the truth. Like even truly confronting our history, the devastating, tragic destruction of the community in Tulsa, and the ways in which we have consistently resisted through rebellion, the history that, I'm trying to bring to the table. All of this, people don't want it to be told. And they say it's, they want this story of American progress as if everything is all good. And as if these problems are all the result of individual and personal responsibility rather than historical inequalities and socioeconomic exclusion. And so it's just, for me, we're not going to be able to move forward unless we really, and it's not, of course, Black, not just Black people, this whole country recognizes just how deep oppression, racial inequality runs. And you can't do that without historical context.
And in some ways, right, you hear people say, or maybe the fear, right, is that because of history, it paints one group of people as the bad people, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I really like to rethink of it as, you know what, there's a reason why this is occurring, right? There's a reason. It's not necessarily pointing fingers. I think true historians, right, and I think what I love again about your book is that it's not pointing a finger at the police. It's not pointing a finger at Black people. What it's saying is that this system, this country has chosen to, the priorities that they've chosen, the policies that have been created, the laws and investments in certain things creates a divestment and an erosion of a true opportunity to create cohesion,
yep,
collaboration, cooperation, and innovation, right? So if anything, I think, no one's pointing fingers. It's really about if you can really have a mirror held up to you, right, into our society, it's not pointing a finger at you, but what it's saying is that we need to look deeper. Maybe mirror is the wrong analogy, but I think it's an opportunity for us, not necessarily to point fingers, but opportunities to try to figure out, again, what role can we each play to improve it, right? Now that we know what's the cause, right? We shouldn't, it's scary, right? To understand like, okay, we have to dismantle a whole system or systems that I totally get. But now it's not about an individual pointing fingers at individuals.
right.
It's like, you know what, we have to hold each other accountable as a society to really move, raise so everyone can feel uplifted and included.
Right. I think you said that beautifully. And I think, what comes with that is, of course, the fight to dismantle the various systems of oppression as they have played out in our communities, but also as a community dealing with some of the things that hold us back and keep us down as a community. And I think, if we're going to realize this change, it's going to take, it's going to take a major movement of shifting people's hearts and minds and building political will and coalition to be able to demand the change. And of course, for that, in many ways, I look to the history of the freedom struggle and the civil rights movement, which came about after decades of organizing and coalition building and keeping the pressure on politicians. It's not as if we want these changes to be realized, that officials are just going to enact new policies out of the goodness of their heart. You have to keep the pressure on. And so keeping that pressure on in many ways is tireless work. And there are many different ways to support that movement, but it's going to take all of us. And it may mean that some of us or many of us have to give something up in the process.
Yeah. And I think that's a very good point. As rosy as I'd like to think the world could be, right? Sometimes I have to find hope, right? I have to continue to be hopeful, mm-hmm. because otherwise it's like I'll go into despair, right? I've been there. Right? And it's not a place to be, right? Especially when we work in professions that we ultimately are there to serve others, right? So you're an educator, mm-hmm. right? And I feel like, okay, I have to see patients, but even being parents, right? My kids are older, I have a 19-year-old and a 22-year-old, but I still see them in this stage of life where they're still adolescents or young adults, right? Emerging young adults. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, they still look look to their parents to see, okay, is there room for optimism? Is there a place? But in most cases, I'm actually looking to them as well, because like you brilliantly put in this book, right? The fact that adolescents, right, and even younger people have led these movements, and it was really evident last year. History repeated itself, right? Adolescents and young adults, they're leading the movement.
Yeah, that's actually, I was thinking the same thing. I don't look to other adults for inspiration. I look to my students. And I look to, again, my kids, although my kids, I guess my kids are what inspire me, but my students give me hope. That's where I think the young people, the new generations, and the people who led the young people who led the protest movements historically and last summer, that's what gives me hope. That's the inspiration, because I think they are, having lived through, and kind of come of age. I'm thinking about your children too, and the kids I teach in college. They came of age and consciousness during the Trump administration and COVID, and then to see, and the protests of last summer are going to be imprinted in their memory. And I don't know, I guess I just have to believe that they are not really standing for the old systems and the old hierarchies that have defined this country historically. Like I really believe that. I'm hopeful. And again, I do have, to a certain extent, a self-selected group of students who want to learn about these topics and come to my class, and they have a sense of probably my politics, but they really give me hope that my children are going to be okay. Because they're not standing for it. They're not standing for it anymore. I think, in some ways that's what these last few years have been about. And I think the fact that they're not standing for it anymore is why there has been so much repression and pushback and all these anti-democratic laws emerging to try to prevent the realization of the true democracy that most, and the kinds of social policies that most Americans want and are ready for.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for me, like, to see, last year when my youngest son, told me he wanted to go to a local protest, right? Black Lives Matter protest. Part of me, had this dual, it's not the exact dual consciousness, right? But in the sense of maybe cognizant dissonance, right? This idea of holding two truths, this fear of him.
Yeah.
Okay. And confrontation, right? A rebellion occurring, right? Versus a pride, right? And that, okay, that's my kid, right? He wants to do good. He wants to stand up and fight for justice, right? And I think that's difficult. It is difficult as a parent, right? For that, right? You want to, and especially I think because of white supremacy, because of racism in our country, I think for so many parents, like, you live in fear, and you have to fight against the urge to parent,
right?
Fear-based parenting, right? And being open to, what, if you allow a grain of hope, right, to take seed and take roots, then that sort of provides a buttress for you, right? I think as a parent, so that when something like this happens, yes, you are fearful, but at the same time, you gotta let it to the side and let your child, be and do, right? Because that's what you want them to be, good people, and you can't hold them back from being, and that's part of being good, I think, right? And doing the work. They have to do the work and find a path for themselves so that they can make the world better.
Right. You're foreshadowing, I know what I imagine will be dilemmas that I will also face. Like, I'm right there with you. I feel it, because I'm thinking, like, of course, I want my kids to go out and protest, but my instinct is also like, wait, like, as their mom, like, no, I want to protect you. And as Black children, like, you are particularly vulnerable to the police violence that I study. So, I imagine that it's something where, but ultimately, it's about, I am deeply committed to the freedom and liberation of my people, of our people, as I imagine, or I deeply hope that my kids will be too. And so I know it's not just about that, but the mama bear in me, if I'm not out there in the streets with them, will be biting my nails, waiting to make sure that they're okay. I mean, but to a certain extent too, every time as Black children, our children leave the house, there's that fear and vulnerability that we have because of police violence and because of white supremacy, right? And the fact that neither of these things have been adequately addressed for reasons that I tried to illuminate in the book.
Yeah, and I think again, I keep saying, you connected a lot of dots, right? There are things that you kind of have a feeling about, right? But not being a historian. Reading the work, and then again the evidence that you present, because many of the things that you highlight in the book, that many of the examples are okay, one, I hadn't heard about some of the rebellions that occurred in different states and cities, but what was also interesting, so that was important for me to know, but the other piece is that there's a long-standing history, right, in many of these areas like Ferguson, other areas like Minnesota, Baltimore, Philadelphia, right? Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, DC. Okay, there's a reason that there continues to be these beats, right? And this constant repetition of these rebellions in the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that was just interesting. Again, it really solidified. Yeah, it makes sense. It totally makes sense.
That was one of the things that, I didn't necessarily expect to find when I started getting interested in these topics as I was researching my first book. And that is just how extensive rebellion was. And I'm really grateful that I was able to include a 25-page timeline of all the rebellions that occurred between 1964 and 2001, well over 2,000, and not just in big cities, but in small towns across the United States. I think the point being that all of us have a stake in this. We all have a stake in this history. Even if you think, if it originally thought, oh, well, this didn't happen in, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or this didn't happen in Waterloo, Iowa, that happened in Los Angeles and Detroit. No, it did. I bet if you listeners, if you do pick up the book, if you even if you browse it at a library in the bookstore, turn and don't buy it, although it'd be great if you did, but turn to the last section and you'll see, I would bet, the last part of the book with the rebellion timeline, and I would bet that your hometown or a city that you lived in or a city that you lived near is in there. Just look it up. We all have a stake in this. This is all of our history. So
what I've been asking a lot of my guests, is about reimagining systems to improve the life of Black children, families. And so I wanted to get your take on it as well, given your research on policing. What are your thoughts about, if you could reimagine, what would be your thoughts of how to reimagine the current systems, or even think outside the box, to really, really make a difference?
Well, one of the things, one of the first steps is we have to end mass incarceration, which has had just such a devastating impact on families of color in particular. I mean, I don't have the exact statistics off the top of my head, but I mean, disproportionate and alarming numbers of Black children in particular have either a parent in prison or a parent that's been to prison at some point during their childhood. I mean, like slavery, right? Mass incarceration has literally ripped families apart, and ending it will improve public safety. I mean, for a long time, policymakers said, well, incarceration is a crime deterrent, and this is the locking people up is the best way to solve crime. And we now know the best data and research shows that there's no link between incarceration and crime rate. So it's not this great crime deterrent. Again, a better crime deterrent are the things the Crips and Bloods were talking about in their proposal in 92: jobs, healthcare, housing, educational opportunities, college scholarships. That's what deters crime. Access to mobility, being mobile deters crime. So I think ending mass incarceration would really go a long way. And with that, maybe turning back to the proposal that the Crips and Bloods laid out, turning back to the Kerner Commission, investing in families, investing in things like early childhood education, which we know leads to lower arrest rates among youth who have been through programs like Head Start in the future, investing in job training programs and job creation programs for young people who are vulnerable to gun violence, investing in kids rather than investing in institutions to lock kids up is a way to, is how we should be, is how in a democracy in particular, we should be thinking about what a reimagined and vibrant community would look like.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. Anything for kids. I'm all for it. Kids and families. So before we head out, is there, for listeners who want to follow you and learn more about you, what are the best places, like either social media, website for them to follow you?
So I'm on Twitter at Elizabeth Hinton. It's at ELIZABHINTON. And unfortunately, I know I'm way behind the times, but I'm a historian who's somewhat adverse to technology, but I'm not really on Facebook or Instagram or anything else. Sometimes I'll pop into Clubhouse, but which is also at Elizabeth Hinton. But mostly I'm on Twitter.
So thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation. Yeah, I learned so much, and it has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jackie. The pleasure's been all mine.
All right. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
So thank you all for joining us for this episode of What is Black, and thank you for listening. And again, Dr. Hinton for joining me today. She shared some great information and ideas. Just want to let everyone know our music and editing is done by Manni Simone. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. And to stay up to date, sign up for our newsletter at whatisblack.co. Thank you.